So according to Steam, I've sunk in over 900 hours into TModLoader, and most of that time has been in Calamity. If you don't know, TModLoader is modded Terraria, and Calamity is undoubtedly the biggest content mod there is. Over the past few months, I've played through Calamity a total of 5 times, one for every class, which means I've experienced and used every single weapon you can craft with shadow spec bars, even the fabstaff and the staff of blushie, which both requires 50 shadow spec bars to craft. But yeah, anyways, I'm going to be ranking these weapons on how cool they are, how effective they are, and by that I mean like DPS and ease of use. But anyways, so melee is actually one of my favorite classes, and we're going to be starting off with a very iconic weapon in my opinion, which is the elemental excalibur. This is probably one of the first weapons I've tried out in this mod, before I started my first real playthrough, because I was just browsing weapons on Heroes mod and I was trying to find the strongest sword in it, and looking back, it very well might be. This weapon shoots different colored projectiles and has different effects, which I think is really cool. So I would put it in S tier because it gets really good damage. The healing effect of the true melee attacks are really good for boss rush, like for mobile bosses and stuff, and it's just an enjoyable weapon all around. However, some of the projectiles actually curve back to the player, which sucks because that means that you're missing a ton of DPS if you're trying to hit an enemy that's far away. Plus, it's not that cool looking to watch these projectiles come right back to your character. So yeah, for that reason I'm dropping it down to an A. Alright, so the next weapon on my list is a draconic destruction, and the thing about this weapon is that it has a sort of unique effect, but it's not really that practical. It doesn't look all that cool, and the only really useful thing about it is it's really good for fighting Leviathan and boss rush, so I'm just going to put it in C. Next we're moving on to Earth, which is actually a really nice weapon to have because the healing on this thing is just insane. It only creates projectiles when you use true melee strikes, but the green meteors that rain down actually increases your healing even more on top of the true healing, or true melee attack healing, and it's just insanely good for tanking stationary bosses and boss rush, and I also think it's pretty cool, so I'm going to put an A. Next we have the animus, which actually gets really good damage, but it's just not cool because it's just a true melee weapon with like RNG. Like the attacks have like a chance of getting a range of damage, but yeah, it's just not cool looking and it's just a boring weapon, so I'm gonna put an F. The illustrious knives, on the other hand, is actually a pretty cool weapon with decent damage, really nice homing capabilities, and a small chance to heal. Basically during boss rush, if I'm fighting a really mobile boss like the Dragonfall and I'm low, I'd swap to this weapon because it homes, it has a chance of getting really good healing. The healing is obviously worse than the elemental excalibur and the earth, just because it's really inconsistent, but still, the homing is really nice, and it also heals, so I'm probably just going to put this in the bottom of A. For the azathoth, it's sort of an interesting weapon, but I don't really use it for boss rush because the bosses move so fast. Even with a very agile yo-yo like this, it's often hard to keep it on something like the Queen Bee, and it's only useful if you sacrifice an accessory slot for the yo-yo bag. But that being said, it's still pretty cool. It can get a lot of damage actually, so I'm going to put it in. The Triactis' true paladin mage hammer of might is the final upgrade of the mid-hard mode weapon, the Fallen Paladin's Hammer, that's upgraded all the way till endgame. It gets really good damage, it looks really cool, it's easy to use, and it's insanely good for group targets and warm bosses and boss rush, so it's getting S tier. So the last melee weapon is a Red Sun, which is sort of interesting because it isn't recommended on the class setups page for endgame, even though it's a sword, and it's made with shadow spec bars. But with that aside, it's sort of like the Burning Sky, but the projectiles stop eventually and make a ton of homing projectiles. It can get decent damage and doesn't require any aiming, but it takes a while for the damage to ramp up just because you have to wait for all of the sky projectiles to stop and then start making the homing projectiles. And it isn't really that cool looking in my opinion, so I'm just going to put it in D. So on to Ranger, and the thing about Ranger is that I generally dislike it and I find it very boring in comparison to the other classes. But anyways, starting off with Soma Prime, it's going in F because much like the Animus, it's very boring to use and it's basically like using the P90 with high velocity bullets. You can't even get the effects of different bullets with it other than like the additional damage. So yeah, it's going in F. Now we have the Contagion, which is also F because it gets really low damage. takes a ton of time to charge up, and has low accuracy, and the trailing orbs just kind of look dumb in my opinion. So yeah. The svantechnical probably has the most unique effect out of all the endgame ranger weapons, especially when used with certain ammo types, but in general it gets lower damage, so I'm going to throw it in D. Finally we have the voidragon, which is a final upgrade of the mini shark, and it's pretty cool. It's definitely Ranger's only option for group targets and worm bosses, but to be honest, I find the purple explosions to be a little too messy, and it's not that fun to use, so I'm going to put in D as well. I actually really like Mage, both in this mod and in vanilla. By the way, I'm counting the yharim's crystal as an endgame weapon because it's a 1% chance from Yharon phase 2. So technically it can be obtained pre-Supreme Calamities, but because it's a 1% drop, it's more likely that people would want to grind for this after beating Supreme Calamities. But anyway, starting off with the Dance of Light. This weapon is pretty cool in my opinion. It has homing capabilities. It's just generally consistent and easy to use, so I'm going to throw it in B. The Eternity is easily A tier, because it looks super cool, uses up literally no mana, gets good damage, and you don't have to aim at all, so you basically just hold left click and everything dies. So the Staff of Blushie is sort of an interesting weapon because it has a really unique way of damaging enemies and has the potential to do really good damage. However, it doesn't have much range at all, and it takes a really long time for the damage to ramp up. And once it's at the point where it gets good damage, it resets and you have to charge it up again, so I'm going to put it in D. The fabstaff isn't a very interesting weapon to use in my opinion. It's similar to the Knight's Ray in all of its upgrades and functionality. But the thing about this weapon is that it gets really good damage even against group targets, and it's insane for farming Supreme Calamities because it's an enclosed space, so the bouncing beam would like multiply its damage by 2 or 3, so it's going to be an A. The yharim's crystal is, in my opinion, just a less cool version of the last prism, because the last prism have like a ton of different colored beams that convert into one, while yharim's crystal is just orange and it doesn't like do too much damage. It uses a ton of mana and is really hard to aim, so it's also going in D. Finally for Mage we have the apotheosis. This weapon is just, it's so dumb how much damage it can do. On super enemies and bosses that don't move around too much, it deals an absurd amount of damage, and it's most likely the highest DPS weapon in the mod, and that along with just the effect of being able to throw out Devour of God heads to annihilate enemies is super cool, so it's easily going in S. Now for Summoner, which I actually think is a pretty cool class in this mod. Now first up we have the Temporal Umbrella, which is actually a really reliable, cool weapon in my opinion. It takes up 5 summon slots, it's just really nice to have, it gets good consistent damage, sits above your head, and it'll always dispatch enemies that are closest to you, and it's just really good and consistent, like I've already said, so I'm gonna put an A. The endogenesis is like your endgame summoner core. This is where most of your damage is most likely gonna come from. It has 4 different modes, including one that shoots homing projectiles, takes up 10 summon slots, and gets really good consistent damage, so I'm gonna put it in A right above the Temporal Umbrella. So the thing about the flamsteed ring is that I'm not sure how effective it'd be compared to just using more summons, but goddamn, it's so cool. I've never seen any weapon like this anywhere. All the animations are really cool. The sword animation is insane. The rocket feature, while I'm not entirely sure how practical it'd be, it's still really cool. And it's just such a unique, cool weapon, I have to put an S. Lastly for Rogue, this class isn't really that cool in my opinion, especially for endgame, but only because 3 of the 4 endgame weapons is also shared by melee. But anyways, the nanoblack Reaper is obviously an A tier because it has a really cool effect, gets really good damage, it's pretty easy to use, so yeah, putting an A. It's just really cool. Okay, so finally the last endgame weapon on this tier list, which is the Scarlet Devil. This weapon is actually pretty cool in my opinion. It can get very good damage actually, and it's just all around pretty cool, but there's one downside, which is that its use time is really low, so if you miss there's a pretty big penalty, but that's a pretty small issue, so I'm just gonna put it in B. Okay, there's my tier list, bye.